Welcome back to my series, Rooted in Rome, where I'm giving you the cultural, historical, and political context that's been taken out of the Christianity story. This is episode 12, and we've been discussing the birth of the Black church. And in this video, we're going to specifically talk about Jim Crow and the theology of survival. Now, we need to talk about what happened when Reconstruction ended, because the freedom and hope of 1865 through 1877 didn't last. There was a compromise in 1877. In exchange for settling a disputed presidential election, Republicans agreed to remove federal troops from the South, and this ended Reconstruction. Here's what this meant. Federal protection for Black civil rights ended. Southern white Democrats regained full control. Black political power was systematically dismantled. Violence against Black people intensified. Over the next 20 years, Southern states passed laws to re-establish white supremacy. These are the Jim Crow laws. There was racial segregation. There were separate schools, bathrooms, water fountains, restaurants. There were voting restrictions, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. All of this disenfranchised Black men. There were vagrancy laws that allowed police to arrest Black people for being unemployed and force them into labor. There were anti-miscegenation laws that were banning interracial marriage. The result? It was illegal apartheid. Black people were segregated, disenfranchised, economically exploited, and terrorized. Between 1877 and 1950, over 4,000 Black people were lynched in the United States. What is lynching? It's extrajudicial murder, often by hanging, burning, or torture, carried out by white mobs. Why did it happen? To maintain white supremacy through terror. Black people were lynched for alleged crimes, often no trial and no evidence. Also, disrespecting white people. Another reason is economic success. Black business owners were targeted. Another reason is trying to vote. And last, defending themselves. Lynchings were public spectacles. They were announced in advance. There were crowds of white people attending, including children. There were photos taken and sold as postcards, and body parts were taken as souvenirs. Churches often remained silent. Some white pastors participated in lynch mobs. Some white churches held services where lynching was justified. The Black church during Jim Crow faced an impossible situation. If they preached resistance openly, they risked their church being burned, their pastor being lynched, and their members being killed. But if they preached submission, they betrayed the gospel of liberation. This created a split in Black church theology. On one side, you had accommodationist theology, which was the Booker T. Washington model. The message was that you work hard and prove your worth, you don't provoke white people, you focus on education and economic advancement, you accept segregation for now, change will come gradually. The representative figure is Booker T. Washington, who was an educator, not a pastor, but his philosophy influenced many Black churches. Washington believed that Black people should focus on vocational training. Don't push for political rights immediately. Prove you're worthy of equality through hard work and respectability. Now, some Black pastors preach this. Be patient, work hard, don't make trouble. God will reward you in time. Now, some Black people did accept this, and the reasons why is safety. Resistance can get you killed. Pragmatism, maybe respectability would work. And exhaustion, people were tired of fighting. The problem with this theology is that it put the burden on Black people to prove they deserved freedom. It accepted white supremacy as temporary but inevitable, and it delayed justice indefinitely. On the other side of this split was resistance theology. This was the W.E.B. Du Bois model. The message is that we are equal now, not eventually. We demand full civil rights. We don't accept segregation. We organize and fight back. The representative figure of W.E.B. Du Bois is that he was a scholar and the co-founder of the NAACP. Du Bois believed that Black people should demand full equality immediately. Political rights are essential. Education should be classical and intellectual, not just vocational. The talented 10th, the educated Black leaders, should lead the struggle. Now, some Black pastors preach this. God freed us. We will not accept re-enslavement. We will fight for justice. This theology continued the liberation tradition from Reconstruction. But the problem with this theology is that it was dangerous. People who preached it openly risked death. So even resistance theology had to be coded or careful. Now, most Black churches during Jim Crow navigated between these two extremes. Publicly, they preached patience and respectability to avoid white violence. They focused on personal salvation and heavenly reward, and they avoided direct political confrontation. But privately, they supported resistance efforts quietly. They provided resources to organizers. They kept the Exodus story alive. They sang spirituals that had double meanings. The Black church became a space of survival, community, hidden resistance, and healing from trauma. The theology that emerged is that suffering produces character. During Jim Crow, some Black churches adopted theology that spiritualized suffering. God is testing you. This trial will make you stronger. Suffering produces perseverance, character, and hope. Where did this come from? Well, partly from Romans 5:3-4. We also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. But this verse, taken out of context, was used to make Black people accept oppression. The problem is that yes, endurance and suffering can build character, but this theology was used to make people passive. Don't fight injustice, just endure. God will reward you. This is a scar from slavery that persisted through Jim Crow. A more hopeful theology also emerged. God will make a way out of no way. This was faith that even when circumstances seemed impossible, God would provide. Songs like We Shall Overcome, which would later become a civil rights anthem, emerged during this period. This theology kept hope alive without requiring passivity. Starting around 1910, Black people began leaving the South in massive numbers. The Great Migration was 6 million Black people who moved from the rural South to northern and western cities between 1910 and 1970. Why they left? Well, they were escaping Jim Crow violence. They were seeking jobs in northern industrial cities. They wanted better education for their children, and they were looking for the right to vote. Where did they go? They went to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and they brought their churches with them. So let me bring this all together. Between 1865 and the 1920s, Black people left white churches and built their own. They created the Black church as the only institution they fully controlled. They preached a theology of liberation rooted in the Exodus. They blended African spiritual practices like hoodoo with Christianity. They survived Jim Crow through a combination of resistance and accommodation. And they began the Great Migration, taking Black church culture north. But the scars of slavery remained. Scar number 1, the accommodationist impulse. Some Black churches continued to preach submission and respectability even after slavery ended. Don't make white people angry. Prove you're worthy. Be patient. This is a scar because it accepts that Black people need to prove their humanity, and it places the burden on the oppressed to change, not on the oppressor. Scar number 2 is spiritualizing suffering. God is testing you through this suffering. Your pain has a purpose. Suffering builds character. This is a scar. because it makes people accept injustice instead of fighting it. Yes, people can find strength through suffering, but suffering caused by oppression should be ended, not spiritualized. Scar number 3 is respectability politics. The idea that if we're good enough, moral enough, respectable enough, white people will accept us. This is a scar because it's based on the lie that black people's behavior is the problem. The problem is white supremacy. No amount of respectability will end oppression. Scar number 4 is rejecting African practices. Some black churches condemned hoodoo and other African spiritual practices as backwards or demonic. This is internalized colonization. The same people who rejected European theology when it came to slavery still accepted European standards of civilization and proper religion. They rejected their own ancestral spiritual practices to prove they were civilized. Scar number 5 is the language of worthlessness. Even in freedom, some black churches kept singing, "I'm nothing without you, Jesus. I'm a wretch. I'm unworthy." This is the language of slavery. Yes, humility before God is biblical, but when you've been told for 250 years that you're inferior, cursed, subhuman, continuing to sing "I'm nothing" is trauma, not theology. But I don't want to end on just the scars, because there was also incredible beauty in what black people created. The black church, despite its scars, was and is a space of freedom. For the first time, black people could worship without white control. They could shout, dance, sing, preach, and pray the way they wanted. It's also a preserver of culture. The black church kept African practices alive even when they were renamed. Call and response, ring shouts, ecstatic worship, connection to ancestors, even when called saints instead. It was a source of resistance. Even when churches had to be careful publicly, they were spaces where people organized, resources were shared, hope was kept alive, liberation theology was preached. It was a place of community. The church was where black people found family. They built networks, they supported each other, they celebrated life, they mourned together, and they survived. The black church that formed between 1865 and the 1920s would become the engine of the civil rights movement. The songs sung during Jim Crow would become freedom songs. The liberation theology preached in whispers will be shouted from the mountaintops. The black church was scarred, but it survived, and it will become the heart of the next great freedom struggle. In the next episode, we're going to follow the Great Migration North. We're going to talk about how black churches grew in northern cities, the birth of gospel music, the rise of new theological movements, and the build-up to the civil rights movement. Because the black church that was born in the Reconstruction South would transform again in the urban North. And those churches, with all their beauty and all their scars, will become the staging ground for one of the greatest freedom movements in American history. Thanks for watching.